Why would Rose refuse a phone call from Bruno Mars? And why did his reaction in this fictionalized interview leave Harrison Keefe visibly surprised? In this dramatized entertainment news scenario, a seemingly simple unanswered call becomes the center of a much bigger mystery. The fictional report begins with Bruno attempting to reach Rose, only to receive no response. At first, it sounds like an ordinary moment of missed communication. But the imagined circumstances surrounding the call make it far more complicated. During the fictionalized interview, Harrison Keefe notices that Bruno's demeanor changes when Rose's name enters the conversation. Bruno, portrayed in this scenario as unusually careful with his words, pauses before responding. His nervous smile disappears. For several seconds, the studio becomes quiet as Harrison decides whether to ask the question everyone watching is already thinking. Why did Rose refuse to answer? And more importantly, why did Bruno seem to expect that she might not? According to the fictional storyline, Bruno does not immediately offer a clear explanation. Instead, his reaction creates another layer of uncertainty. A small detail mentioned during the imagined interview suggests that the phone call may have happened after an emotionally complicated moment, one that neither Bruno nor Rose was apparently ready to discuss publicly. That detail is enough to send the fictional audience looking for answers. Was the call simply misunderstood? Was Bruno trying to say something he had never managed to say before? Or was Rose refusing to answer because she already knew exactly what Bruno wanted to talk about? Then Harrison Keefe asks one question that changes the entire direction of the fictional interview, and Bruno's reaction makes the mystery even harder to ignore. In this fictionalized entertainment news scenario, the controversy begins with something deceptively ordinary, a phone call that was never answered. According to the dramatized storyline, Bruno Mars attempts to contact Rose at a moment when emotions are already running high, but the call goes unanswered. There is no dramatic confrontation, no public argument, and no confirmed explanation. Yet somehow, that silence becomes more interesting than an answer could have been. The imagined report presents Bruno as someone who had apparently thought carefully before making the call. He was not portrayed as casually reaching out or dialing without a reason. Instead, the fictional scenario suggests that he hesitated, reconsidered, and finally decided that whatever he needed to say was important enough to risk an uncomfortable conversation. But Rose did not pick up. That single unanswered call becomes the first piece of a puzzle that neither the fictional audience nor Harrison Keefe can immediately solve. What makes the situation more intriguing is Bruno's reaction afterward. In this dramatized storyline, he does not become angry, nor does he immediately try again. Instead, he reportedly sits with the silence, as though he already understands why Rose might have chosen not to answer. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If Bruno knew there was a possibility she would refuse the call, why did he make it anyway? The fictional audience begins considering several explanations. Perhaps Rose was simply unavailable. Perhaps she needed distance. Perhaps the timing was wrong. Or perhaps within the storyline, there was something emotionally significant behind that unanswered call that Bruno had not yet revealed. The mystery becomes even stronger when Harrison Keefe later brings the subject into the fictionalized interview. Rather than asking Bruno directly about the call at first, Harrison approaches the subject carefully, allowing Bruno to speak about communication, pressure, and difficult conversations. Bruno appears composed, but the fictional interview portrays subtle changes whenever the conversation moves closer to Rose. His answers become shorter, his pauses become longer. And at one point, Harrison notices that Bruno seems to choose his next words unusually carefully. That moment becomes important because the fictional report suggests the unanswered call was never really about the phone itself. It may have been about what Bruno was trying to communicate before Rose decided she was not ready to hear it. But there was still one detail the fictional audience did not know. What exactly had happened immediately before Bruno made that call? The imagined interview takes place in a quiet professional studio, with cameras positioned directly toward Bruno Mars and Harrison Keefe sitting across from him. At first, the atmosphere appears completely routine. Harrison begins with comfortable questions about Bruno's creative process, the pressure of performing, and how he handles moments when the public expects him to have an answer for everything. Bruno responds calmly within the fictional scenario, occasionally smiling and making light jokes, but Harrison is clearly building towards something more personal. Instead of mentioning Rose immediately, he allows the conversation to develop naturally, knowing that a sudden question could cause Bruno to shut down. After several minutes, Harrison finally brings up the subject of communication. He asks Bruno whether there are moments when a person can become too famous to communicate normally with someone they genuinely care about. In this dramatized scenario, Bruno pauses before answering. He gives a small smile and looks briefly toward the floor. His response remains careful, suggesting that fame can make ordinary conversations much more complicated. Harrison follows with another question. Do you ever avoid making a call because you're afraid of the answer? Bruno laughs nervously, but the laughter does not last long. He takes a breath and responds that sometimes the hardest part is not making the call, but accepting that the other person may not be ready to answer. That answer immediately changes the atmosphere. Harrison does not need to mention Rose yet. The fictional audience already understands where the conversation appears to be heading. Harrison then asks whether Bruno has ever made a call knowing there was a chance it would be ignored. Bruno becomes noticeably quieter. In the imagined interview, he does not deny the possibility. Instead, he says that sometimes you make a call because staying silent feels worse. Harrison watches him carefully. The question has clearly landed somewhere deeper than expected. A few seconds pass before Harrison asks the next question. Was that call about Rose? Bruno's expression changes. The fictionalized report emphasizes that this is not presented as a real-world exchange, but within the imagined scenario, the moment becomes the turning point of the interview. Bruno looks toward Harrison, then briefly toward one of the cameras. He smiles, but it is a nervous smile rather than the relaxed expression from earlier. Harrison does not immediately press him. He allows the silence to remain. That silence becomes more revealing than any dramatic statement could have been. Finally, Bruno gives a cautious response, suggesting that Rose's name is connected to a conversation he had been thinking about for some time. But he stops there. Harrison notices the hesitation and asks whether Rose knew he was going to call. Bruno does not answer immediately. He takes a deep breath, folds his hands together, and appears to consider whether continuing would reveal something he had intended to keep private within the fictional storyline. Then he says only that sometimes people know a conversation is coming long before the phone actually rings. Harrison leans forward slightly. The fictional interview has now moved far beyond a simple unanswered call. The question is no longer whether Rose refused to answer. The bigger question is what Bruno believed he needed to tell her in the first place, and why he seemed so uncertain about how she would react. The atmosphere inside the fictionalized studio changes the moment Harrison Keefe decides to ask Bruno Mars directly about Rose. Until this point, the imagined interview has allowed Bruno to speak about communication without naming the person behind the mystery, but Harrison knows that avoiding the name can only last for so long. He looks toward Bruno and asks a simple question. What happened between you and Rose? In the dramatized scenario, Bruno does not answer immediately. His expression becomes noticeably more serious. He looks down for a moment, then gives a brief nervous smile that quickly disappears. The cameras remain focused on him as Harrison waits. Bruno takes a slow breath before explaining that not every difficult conversation begins with an argument. Sometimes, he says within the fictional narrative, it begins with something that was never said. Harrison notices the wording and immediately follows up. Was that why you called her? Bruno's hands move slightly as he considers the question. He eventually answers that the call was connected to something he felt needed to be addressed, but he refuses to explain exactly what that something was. That incomplete answer creates an even larger curiosity gap. Why would Bruno make the call if he was unwilling to explain its purpose? And why would Rose, according to the fictional storyline, choose not to answer? Harrison then asks whether Bruno was surprised when the call went unanswered. This time, Bruno gives a small shake of his head. His response suggests that he may have anticipated the possibility. That reaction becomes one of the most important details in the imagined interview because it changes the meaning of the entire situation. If Bruno expected Rose might refuse the call, then perhaps the unanswered phone was not the beginning of the story. It was the consequence of something that had already happened. Harrison notices the shift and asks another direct question. Did you think she was angry? Bruno smiles faintly and says that anger was not necessarily the right word. He pauses again. In the fictionalized scenario, that pause seems deliberate, almost as though he is trying to protect someone who is not sitting in the room. Harrison does not let the moment pass. He asks whether Rose had a reason to avoid speaking with him. Bruno looks toward Harrison and replies that people sometimes need time before hearing something emotionally difficult. That answer leaves Harrison visibly curious. The fictional report portrays him leaning slightly forward, lowering his voice and asking whether Bruno's call was about an apology. Bruno remains silent for several seconds. Then he gives a cautious response. Maybe it was about understanding. It is an intentionally incomplete answer, and Harrison immediately recognizes that there is more beneath it. The imagined audience is now left with several possibilities. Perhaps Bruno wanted to apologize. Perhaps he wanted to explain something Rose had misunderstood. Perhaps he simply wanted one honest conversation away from cameras, headlines, and public expectations. But Bruno's discomfort suggests that the unanswered call may have carried far more emotional weight than anyone initially assumed. Harrison finally asks the question that makes Bruno visibly uncomfortable. Did you already know she wouldn't answer? Bruno looks away, takes another deep breath, and remains silent. And in that silence, the fictionalized interview creates its biggest question yet. What happened before Bruno ever reached for his phone? At this point in the fictionalized storyline, the unanswered call begins to take on several possible meanings, and none of them can be treated as confirmed fact. The dramatized report deliberately leaves room for different interpretations because Rose's reason for not answering has never been established within the scenario. One possibility is simply timing. Perhaps Rose was overwhelmed, unavailable, or dealing with her own emotions and did not feel ready to speak. Another possibility is that the call arrived after a difficult conversation, making even a simple phone call feel emotionally complicated. But there is another interpretation that becomes more interesting because of Bruno's reaction in the imagined interview. What if Rose did not refuse the call because she wanted to reject Bruno, but because she already understood what he wanted to say? That possibility changes everything. If she knew the purpose of the call, then ignoring it could have been a deliberate decision to postpone a conversation she was not prepared to have. Within the fictional scenario, Harrison Keefe explores this possibility carefully. He asks Bruno whether Rose had previously indicated that she needed space. Bruno does not give a direct answer. Instead, he explains that sometimes people communicate their boundaries without saying them directly. Harrison then asks whether Bruno respected that boundary. Bruno hesitates again, and the fictionalized report uses that hesitation to create tension. His reaction does not confirm anything about a real-world relationship or real-world event, it simply becomes part of the imagined storyline. Harrison continues by presenting another possibility. Perhaps Bruno had called because something important had changed. Bruno listens without interrupting. His expression remains serious, but he does not confirm the suggestion. The fictional narrative then introduces a subtle clue. Before making the call, Bruno had allegedly spent time thinking about what he wanted to say. Again, this is entirely part of the dramatized scenario. It is not presented as a verified event, but within the story, that detail suggests the call was emotionally deliberate rather than spontaneous. A third possibility emerges. Maybe Bruno was not calling to ask Rose for anything at all. Perhaps he simply wanted to give her information, clarify a misunderstanding, or finally say something he had been unable to express face to face. That interpretation makes Rose's refusal even more complicated. If the call was not a demand but an attempt at closure, why would she still avoid it? Harrison eventually asks Bruno whether he was disappointed. Bruno smiles briefly and answers that disappointment is not always about being rejected. Sometimes, he says within the fictionalized conversation, disappointment comes from realizing that two people may care about the same situation but be ready to deal with it at completely different times. That statement becomes one of the most emotionally significant moments in the imagined interview. It suggests that the conflict may not have been about anger at all. It may have been about timing, fear, or things left unsaid. Yet just when the fictional audience begins to believe the mystery might be explained by simple miscommunication, Harrison notices another detail in Bruno's reaction. Bruno appears less concerned about why Rose ignored the call than about what might happen if she eventually answered. And that raises a much bigger question: what exactly was Bruno preparing to tell her? The fictionalized interview becomes even more tense when Harrison Keefe stops discussing possibilities and asks Bruno Mars the question that has been hanging over the entire conversation. What did you want to tell Rose? For several seconds, Bruno says nothing. In the imagined scenario, the studio suddenly feels quieter. The cameras remain fixed on him. Harrison waits without interrupting, and Bruno appears to search for an answer that will not reveal more than he intends. He finally smiles nervously and says that sometimes the most important conversations are the ones people spend the longest avoiding. It is an emotional answer, but it is not an explanation. Harrison immediately notices that Bruno has avoided the question itself. He asks again, more directly, "What was the call really about?" Bruno takes a deep breath. His expression changes from nervousness to something more reflective. Within this fictional storyline, he admits that the call was connected to something he had been carrying for a while, but he still refuses to identify exactly what it was. That incomplete response only deepens the mystery. Harrison asks whether Bruno was trying to apologize. Bruno pauses and says, "Not exactly." Harrison asks whether he was trying to explain himself. Again, Bruno hesitates. "Maybe," he eventually responds. The fictionalized exchange makes it clear that Bruno is deliberately choosing his words. He is not portrayed as angry with Rose, nor does he accuse her of doing anything wrong. Instead, his behavior suggests that he believes there are two sides to the situation, and perhaps he understands why Rose would hesitate to hear him. Harrison then asks the question that seems to hit Bruno hardest. "Were you afraid of what she might say?" Bruno looks down before answering. He admits within the dramatized scenario that he was more afraid of what silence might mean. That sentence creates another emotional turn. The fictional audience is no longer simply wondering why Rose ignored the call. Now they are wondering whether Bruno himself had something to lose by making it. Harrison follows carefully. "Then why call her at all?" Bruno's response is brief. "Because I couldn't leave it unfinished." The answer provides a clue but not a conclusion. Something apparently had been left unresolved within the fictional storyline. Harrison senses that there is more and asks whether Rose knew about that unresolved issue. Bruno does not answer immediately. His eyes move briefly toward the floor and he exhales before saying that she probably understood more than he realized. That statement changes the emotional dynamic once again. If Rose already understood what Bruno wanted to discuss, then perhaps her refusal was not confusion. Perhaps it was a choice. Harrison then asks whether Bruno expected her to call back. Bruno gives a faint smile and says he hoped she would, but he did not want to pressure her. The fictional report portrays that answer as important because it shows Bruno caught between wanting an answer and respecting Rose's silence. Yet Harrison is not satisfied. He has heard enough to know that the unanswered call was only the visible part of the story. Something happened before Bruno reached for the phone, and whatever it was may explain why he sounded so uncertain during the interview. Then Harrison asks one final question: "What happened before you made that call?" Bruno becomes completely silent. And for the first time in the fictionalized interview, it appears that the real story may finally be approaching the surface. The silence that follows Harrison Keefe's question becomes the most revealing moment of the fictionalized interview so far. What happened before you made that call? Within this dramatized scenario, Bruno Mars does not immediately respond. He leans back slightly, takes a deep breath, and looks toward the floor. For the first time, the imagined audience is given the impression that the unanswered call may have been connected to something much more personal than a simple misunderstanding. Bruno eventually explains that before making the call, he had been thinking about a conversation that never reached the ending either person expected. He does not describe Rose as responsible, and he does not portray himself as completely innocent. Instead, the fictional storyline presents the situation as something far more human, two people who may have understood the same moment in completely different ways. Harrison listens carefully before asking whether that earlier conversation was the reason Rose did not answer. Bruno says he cannot know what Rose was thinking. That answer is important because it prevents the fictional narrative from turning Rose's silence into a confirmed accusation. She may have been protecting herself, processing her emotions, or simply deciding that the timing was wrong. The imagined report then reveals another piece of context. According to the fictional storyline, Bruno had apparently received information suggesting that Rose might have misunderstood something he had previously said or done. Rather than immediately defending himself through another public statement, Bruno decided to contact her privately. That decision becomes central to the story. He was not calling to create a headline. He was calling because within the fictional scenario, he believed a private explanation might prevent a larger misunderstanding. But there was a problem. Rose may already have been tired of explanations. Harrison asks whether Bruno considered sending a message instead of calling. Bruno gives a small nod and admits that he thought about it, but he believed a written message could make things even worse because words on a screen can easily be misunderstood. A phone call, he believed, would allow both people to hear each other's tone, yet the fictional scenario suggests that Rose may have felt the opposite. A call could be more emotionally intense precisely because there would be nowhere to hide behind carefully chosen words. That difference in communication becomes the hidden context behind the unanswered phone. Bruno wanted clarity, Rose may have wanted space. Neither intention is presented as confirmed fact, both belong entirely to the dramatized storyline. Harrison then asks whether Bruno regretted making the call. Bruno looks directly at him and answers that he regretted only one thing: waiting so long. The statement creates another emotional layer. Perhaps the real problem was not the call itself. Perhaps it was everything that happened before it. The imagined audience now begins to reinterpret Bruno's earlier hesitation. His nervousness may not have come from fear of rejection alone. It may have come from knowing that one conversation could force both sides to confront something they had avoided for too long. Harrison asks whether Rose knew how important the conversation was to him. Bruno pauses again. "I don't know," he says within the fictional interview. That uncertainty becomes the heart of the story. Because if Rose did not understand why Bruno was calling, her refusal could have meant something completely different. But if she did understand, then the silence may have carried a message of its own. And Harrison Keefe is about to ask the one question that could determine which interpretation makes the most sense. Harrison Keefe knows the fictionalized interview has reached the point where another indirect question will not be enough. He looks at Bruno Mars and asks, "Did Rose know why you were calling?" Bruno remains silent for several seconds. In the dramatized scenario, he takes a deep breath before answering that he believes she probably did, but he could never be completely certain. Harrison immediately follows with another question. "Then why didn't you tell her beforehand?" Bruno's expression changes. The nervous smile returns briefly before disappearing again. He explains within the fictional storyline that there are some conversations people are afraid to announce because announcing them can make the other person feel pressured. Harrison leans forward and asks whether that means Bruno was trying to protect Rose or himself. Bruno does not answer directly. Instead, he says that sometimes the difference between those two things becomes difficult to recognize. That response leaves the fictional audience with another possibility. Perhaps Bruno's call was not simply about explaining something to Rose. Perhaps it was also about finally confronting his own feelings about what had happened. Harrison then asks the most uncomfortable question yet. "Were you hoping she would forgive you?" Bruno looks away. After a long pause, he admits that forgiveness was not the reason he called. He wanted Rose to hear his side directly rather than through rumors, assumptions, or other people. The answer creates an important shift in the fictional narrative. The call was not necessarily an attempt to force Rose into a particular response. It may have been an attempt to make sure she knew the truth as Bruno understood it. Harrison asks whether Rose ever called back. Bruno pauses before saying that within this imagined scenario, the answer is not as simple as yes or no. Something had changed before that conversation could happen. Harrison notices the hesitation and asks what changed. Bruno looks toward him and finally reveals the central fictional explanation. The call came after Bruno realized that a misunderstanding between them had grown because neither person wanted to make the first move. Rose's refusal, therefore, was not portrayed as hatred or hostility. It was her decision to avoid an emotional conversation before she felt ready. Bruno's nervousness came from knowing that the call might reopen something both had tried to leave alone. And Harrison's questioning exposed the detail Bruno had been carefully avoiding. He had waited too long to explain himself. Within this dramatized storyline, the unanswered call becomes less about rejection and more about timing. Bruno wanted to speak when he finally found the courage. Rose needed silence when she finally realized she needed space. Neither side is presented as entirely right or wrong. That is what makes the fictional revelation emotionally significant. It transforms a seemingly dramatic celebrity mystery into a story about two people failing to communicate at the same moment. The fictional audience is then shown how quickly public curiosity can turn a private misunderstanding into something much larger. Viewers begin debating whether Rose made the right decision, whether Bruno should have called earlier, and whether either person could have prevented the situation by simply speaking honestly. But there is another layer. The imagined story suggests that Bruno's biggest realization was not about Rose's refusal. It was about his own responsibility. He had assumed that eventually there would be a perfect moment to explain everything. That moment never came. And when he finally made the call, the person he needed to reach was no longer ready to listen. That realization leaves Bruno visibly emotional within the fictionalized interview. Harrison does not push him further. For several seconds, neither man speaks. The cameras continue recording as the silence says more than another question could, and that silence becomes the emotional conclusion of the fictional report. The central fictional revelation is surprisingly simple. Bruno did not call Rose because he wanted something from her. According to the dramatized storyline, he called because he wanted to correct a misunderstanding that had been allowed to grow for too long. Rose did not refuse because she necessarily wanted to hurt him. She refused because, within the fictional scenario, she was not ready to reopen the conversation. That difference completely changes the meaning of the original controversy. The unanswered call was never presented as proof of a dramatic feud. It was a symbol of two people reaching the same conversation at different times. Bruno wanted answers when Rose wanted distance. Rose wanted time when Bruno finally wanted clarity. Harrison's fictionalized interview simply exposed how complicated that timing had become. And Bruno's reaction suggested that the real regret was not making the call. It was waiting until the silence had already become so difficult to break. Within the fictional storyline, viewers quickly divide into different interpretations. Some sympathize with Bruno, believing that his decision to make the call shows he genuinely wanted to resolve the misunderstanding privately. Others sympathize with Rose, arguing that refusing a call can sometimes be a legitimate way of protecting personal boundaries. Another group remains uncertain, focusing instead on the question of what happened before the call. The imagined audience debates whether Bruno should have reached out sooner and whether Rose might eventually be willing to hear him. Importantly, these reactions belong entirely to the fictional scenario and are not presented as actual social media reactions or verified public statements. What makes the story compelling is that neither interpretation completely eliminates the mystery. Bruno may have explained why he called, but the fictional storyline still leaves one emotional question unanswered. What did Rose feel when she saw his name appear on her phone? At its core, this fictionalized story is not really about a missed phone call. It is about the pressure created when private emotions exist under a very public spotlight. Bruno Mars, within the dramatized narrative, is portrayed as someone who discovers that fame cannot solve a simple human problem. Sometimes an explanation arrives after someone has already decided they need silence. Rose's fictional refusal does not have to represent anger, rejection, or hostility. It can simply represent a boundary. And Bruno's decision to call does not automatically make him right or wrong. It represents an attempt to communicate after too much time has passed. That is what makes the imagined interview emotionally significant. Harrison Keefe's questions do not uncover a scandal. They uncover something more relatable: miscommunication, hesitation, pride, timing, and the fear of saying something important too late. For Bruno, the fictional lesson is uncomfortable but clear. Sometimes you can have every opportunity in the world to speak, yet still miss the moment when someone was ready to listen. And that brings the fictional story back to the unanswered call that started everything. Bruno had finally decided to reach out. Rose had decided not to answer. Harrison had uncovered the emotional context behind the decision. But one question remains hanging over the entire dramatized scenario. If Bruno knew Rose might refuse the call, why did he make it anyway? Was he simply trying to correct a misunderstanding? Or was there something much more personal he desperately needed her to hear? And if Rose eventually decides to answer, what will she say when Bruno finally gets the conversation he had been waiting for? Because in this fictional story, the phone may have stopped ringing, but the conversation is far from over.